I guess a good thing to talk about that I don't think I've talked about before is that a lot of Yankoids and just liberals in general, I guess, like Westerners in general, don't understand that media basically all over the world is privately owned, like 80%, 90% by like what I will call the international bourgeoisie. What the international bourgeoisie means is like the sector of the capitalist class that have a lot to gain from sucking up to the West, because there are other sectors of the bourgeoisie who are more like inward focused, like for example local industrial bourgeois, etc. They might have a bit of a different view regarding international trade because they want to build up their own country's productive capacity, and that can't be allowed to happen unless you're China, which was done by the state. So generally, the media basically all over the world is Western propaganda. And it's not really a grand conspiracy. It's because it's owned by people who have to gain from Western hegemony in their countries, from selling off their country to the West, to the US, to the EU. So what you see in the US, where you have like obviously like the bourgeois media monopoly, which is also the same in pretty much every country. Like the most that you get in the mainstream media is like The Guardian, which is like a slightly like the neoliberal narrative with a human face sort of thing. We should still exploit these countries, but overall our hegemony is good. We just kind of want to redistribute the gains that we get from doing that. And those sorts of interests are completely aligned with the media in the third world. The most basic sort of systemic material analysis will have you arrive very quickly at the conclusion that the media everywhere, where it is supposedly free, is just controlled predominantly by the big bourgeoisie, the international bourgeoisie, whose interests globally are almost entirely aligned. And the only countries where this isn't exactly the case is in countries like Russia and China, where there's more state media control. But in those countries still, that doesn't mean the media is better. It just means that it doesn't particularly sway to like the Western interests as hard. But it's still obviously going to be swayed by bourgeois interests because the so-called Russian oligarchs are the ones who have a lot of power in Russia. They sort of gain power. They gain their power through the state, which was facilitated like during the transition from the USSR. They managed to gain the power that they have now through their relations with the state, through being able to buy a ton of state assets at bullshit prices, which was something that was facilitated through the neoliberal transition by the EU and the US. Though it's a different sort of relation, but it still obviously advocates for their interests, but their interests are just sort of a bit different to those of like the Western bourgeoisie, who are oligarchs too. Like the US, EU, etc. These are states that are honestly even more corporate captured. In Russia, the bourgeoisie have a bit more of an allegiance to the state. It's more of a collaboration than it is capture, which isn't particularly better, it's just different. The idea that there's like a free press is obviously bullshit. Any country in the world, the media is obviously owned by the big bourgeoisie, overwhelmingly by the big bourgeoisie. From the US, it's the same in the US, it's the same in Argentina, it's the same in any country in the world with a market economy, a neoliberal market economy, which is the majority. And the media there is going to be generally overwhelmingly pro whatever would happen to be in favor of these people's interests, which just so happens to be the vast majority of the time selling off their entire country to the interests of the US and the Western Bloc in general. In that respect, this is all basically exactly the same. The same propaganda that you get in the US is spoon-fed people in all over Latin America, all over Africa, over a lot of Asia, etc. So like the sort of like Western supremacist ideology has filtered through to the entire world. Americans are really stupid and don't generally understand or do not care or like buy into these sorts of narratives that like the right wing isn't that bad in other countries. Like they are the bad guys. The people who they're aligned with are just overtly the bad guys. Like the US state is, for example, overtly aligned with the Colombian right, who are the representatives of the big bourgeoisie there, who control the entire media apparatus and who mass murder people constantly. I guess really the only reason why the liberals in the US, who are economically completely aligned with these people, by the way, don't do the same thing because they don't particularly need to, because the population is far more pacified there, sort of ironically thanks to the spoils that they get from exploiting these other countries. This is just generally like this complete lack of systemic analysis that Westoids have, where they like imagine everyone else in the world, or everyone in the world basically to them, like is making a series of free and sovereign decisions rather than decisions that are completely manipulated and dictated by the mainstream media, the allowable spectrum of opinion which they dictate, which is generally dictated by the interests that are aligned between the big Western capitalists and the big third world capitalists, or in many cases directly by the Western capitalists who generally own a lot in these countries as well. Just something that I've been dealing with recently, because these people talk about, like, for example, like Ukraine making sovereign decisions to align with the US or NATO or whatever over Russia. And it goes for like countries that are more aligned with Russia too, like Kazakhstan. Like the idea that they're making sovereign decisions is just so fucking funny. No one's making a sovereign decision when your politics have been interfered with for like decades upon decades. Like your media is completely captured by interests that are at the very least completely aligned with the big Western capitalist interests. And you have a political system that is specifically designed to be like a failsafe against anything even remotely radically left. Obviously not against the radical right, because the radical right are amicable to the interests of the big capitalists, so they're fine. It's completely designed to protect their interests, every single thing about it. Well, I wouldn't say, it's not really, the political system isn't more intelligently designed, but the media landscape is just sort of a reflection of where you would expect it to be, just based on the most basic sort of material analysis. Like obviously the media is going to reflect these sorts of opinions because it's owned by people who want it to. Not so much by people, in many cases not even owned by identifiable individuals, but rather by like conglomerates, by hedge funds, by like holding companies and shit like that, with boards of directors who just want to make a profit for their shareholders. Their shareholders who are overwhelmingly big business owners and who are investing in these media companies in the first place because they know that they are going to be amicable to their interests as the big bourgeoisie. Liberals in general do not want to understand this, even if they could. They trust like the base notion of like respectability. Like the idea that, like, for example, the New York Times is just like a respectable publication with a history of being reputable or whatever, and therefore you can trust what it says. Like the idea that like you don't need to assess your information on a case-by-case basis to really look at it critically, but rather just take it based on who is saying it. The New York Times says it, it's correct. No questions asked, like, why is the New York Times saying this? Can we really trust them? Whose interests do they serve? What motivations might they have for reporting on this, for skewing it in a certain way? Is it even remotely true or not? Is the evidence for it really lining up? Is there a reason why they're reporting on this and not other things? How's it being framed? Just random questions like that. They don't ask because they don't see things as like systems. They see things as just trustworthiness. That's where like the fucking hilarious Hunter Avallone soundbite. If you don't trust the CIA, then who do you trust? Like, it's not that you need to critically analyze information and think about what they're saying and why and whether it's true or not. It's just that you need to like look at the source of information, decide whether you trust it or not, and then take whatever it says as gospel. That's how they operate. And I'd hope that most of you are smarter than that, though I know that you're not, because you're watching me and you treat me like that. But yeah, it's the same as this all over the world. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. Manufacturing consent doesn't just apply to the USA, it applies to everywhere. Consent is being manufactured in US victim countries as well. Overwhelmingly, the TV news, for example, here where I live in Argentina, TV news, print news, online news, is owned and run by and for US puppet right-wingers. So you really got to think about how bad the right wing is, that despite this media control, they still managed, at least in the last 20 years or so, they've still managed to fumble through even like the electoral politics that have been set up in a way to advantage them, through like the massive pressure, international pressure put on anything even remotely like center left by the Western imperialist bloc, literally through not just diplomatically, clandestinely, but also economically through the fucking International Monetary Fund, especially through the IMF. How fucking incompetent and moronic they must be. The fact that like the US and its cronies have such control over everything here, and they ever managed to lose, that like the pink tide was ever a thing, that like current much weaker, like desaturated pink tide is a thing. It's just sad. And it really speaks to how dumb Americans are and how dumb their cronies are. Of course, like, Americans don't understand the systemic nature of their imperialism. They only understand, like, really overt sort of actions. So they don't understand the level of control that, like, the Western Bloc has basically over the entire world, economically, through the media, socially, politically. Even, like, the very political systems that many countries have are a Western imposition, a Western ideological imposition. These subtle levels of control that they just don't understand. But I mean, even on their own terms, where you just like look at the really overt actions, like literal wars and direct obvious interventions and stuff that have been admitted to, they lose. But they lose even harder when you fucking look at the systemic levels of control and manipulation that they do to keep down people all over the world, to oppress and exploit people everywhere. China is barely even doing that. Russia definitely doesn't do it, at least not to that systemic level, outside of their own immediate borders. Basically, Americans are dumb and only know how to drink oil and eat hamburger. That's the thesis of this.